Canada, and several European nations are quietly deepening political and economic coordination in ways that signal a gradual shift in how Western alliances operate. There has been no announcement declaring a new bloc and no treaty redefining obligations. Instead, the change has emerged through aligned policies, shared priorities, and increasingly synchronized diplomatic behavior that together indicate a recalibration of influence across the Atlantic. For decades, Western cooperation revolved around American leadership. Canada and Europe worked closely with Washington on trade security and global governance. Even when disagreements surfaced, the assumption remained that the United States would ultimately set direction. That assumption is now less certain as allies reassess risk stability and long-term predictability. The United States remains a dominant global power with unmatched military capabilities and economic reach. Yet domestic political volatility, abrupt policy shifts, and transactional diplomacy have encouraged partners to diversify relationships. Rather than concentrating reliance on a single center of power, Canada and Europe are expanding coordination with one another to ensure continuity regardless of changes in Washington. This approach does not represent rejection or confrontation. Canadian and European officials continue to emphasize shared values, cooperation, and partnership with the United States. The difference lies in expectations. Leadership is no longer presumed automatic and alignment is no longer unconditional. Canada has played a distinctive role in this evolution. As a country deeply integrated with the American economy yet institutionally stable and internationally engaged, Canada offers Europe a bridge between continents. Canadian policymakers have increasingly emphasized strategic diversification, seeking to strengthen ties beyond traditional channels while maintaining existing alliances. European governments have welcomed this engagement, facing their own reassessment of strategic autonomy. European leaders have sought reliable partners who value multilateral frameworks and long-term planning. Multilaterals who of frameworks and long-term planning, Canada fits that profile, offering political consistency, regulatory compatibility, in diplomatic credibility. The alignment has developed through practical cooperation rather than ideological statements. Regulatory coordination, trade frameworks, research partnerships, and climate initiatives have created dense networks of interaction. Each initiative alone appears technical and limited. Together, they form a foundation for deeper collaboration independent of American direction. Trade policy illustrates the shift. Canada and European nations have aligned standards across environmental regulation, digital governance, and industrial policy. These shared rules reduce friction for businesses and allow cross-border commerce to expand without reliance on United States frameworks. When large markets adopt common standards, global companies adapt to maintain access. As a result, Canada and Europe exert influence beyond their borders, shaping international practices through market gravity rather than political pressure. Diplomatic coordination has followed a similar pattern. On climate action, technology oversight, and institutional reform, Canadian and European positions increasingly align. These positions are not framed as opposition to American policy, but are developed collaboratively without waiting for Washington to lead. From the American perspective, this represents a redistribution of influence. Coordination that once flowed through Washington now occurs along parallel paths. The United States remains involved but no longer occupies every central role. This change carries political implications for leaders who emphasize dominance and leverage. Influence must increasingly be negotiated rather than assumed. For Canada and Europe, the strategy is quiet, deliberate, and incremental. There is no defining moment. Shift unfolds through consistency rather than confrontation. The evolving coordination between Canada and Europe has significant implications for political figures whose foreign policy strategies depend on leverage and visible control. Donald Trump's approach to international relations emphasized transactional bargaining, where loyalty was expected and pressure was a primary tool. Trade threats, public criticism, and conditional support were used to reinforce American dominance and extract concessions from partners. As allies develop alternatives, that strategy loses effectiveness. When Canada and Europe align independently, pressure tactics carry higher costs and yield fewer results. The ability to impose terms depends on dependency, and that dependency is gradually declining. During earlier disputes with European governments, tariffs and unilateral decisions strained relationships, while alliances endured, trust was weakened. Those experiences encouraged European leaders to consider how to reduce vulnerability to sudden policy shifts. Canada observed these dynamics closely and drew similar conclusions. Rather than confrontational rhetoric, Canada pursued a different path. Its strategy focused on quiet coordination, mutual benefit, and institutional alignment. This approach avoided public conflict while still achieving strategic diversification. The result is less visible than a dramatic rupture, but more durable over time. European leaders have found this model appealing. By strengthening ties with Canada, they reduce reliance on American leadership without provoking backlash. Cooperation is framed as modernization, adaptation, and resilience rather than defiance. Security cooperation remains anchored in established institutions. Military alliances continue, and shared commitments remain intact. However, political and economic coordination increasingly extends beyond those structures. Influence is no longer concentrated in a single capital but distributed across networks. Inside the United States, official responses have been measured. Public statements emphasize partnership continuity and shared values. Analysts, however, recognize that alliance dynamics are shifting. Automatic deference to American leadership can no longer be assumed across all domains. This shift alters negotiation dynamics in subtle ways. When partners have options, threats lose credibility. Ultimatums generate resistance. Cooperation must be built through persuasion and compromise rather than pressure. Economic considerations reinforce this trend. Recent global disruptions exposed vulnerabilities in supply chains heavily dependent on single sources or political goodwill. Canada and Europe have responded by prioritizing resilience, diversification, and redundancy, even at the cost of short-term efficiency. Shared investment strategies, joint research initiatives, and coordinated industrial policies aim to reduce exposure to unilateral decisions. Canada's participation adds scale, resources, and geographic reach, enhancing Europe's capacity to act independently. The United States remains a critical economic and security partner. Its markets, technology, and military capabilities are indispensable, yet it is no longer the sole reference point for decision-making. Allies increasingly consult one another, directly shaping outcomes collaboratively. For Trump, this environment complicates political messaging. Claims of dominance resonate less when allies demonstrate autonomy without hostility. Influence becomes relational, built through trust and cooperation rather than imposed through leverage. The erosion of influence is gradual. There is no dramatic break, no formal exclusion. Instead, alternatives mature quietly. As they do, reliance shifts incrementally. Other nations are observing this process. Middle powers watch whether Canada can deepen alliances without retaliation. Success could encourage similar strategies elsewhere, further diffusing influence. Canada and Europe appear committed to their course. Officials emphasize stability, predictability, and long-term planning. The absence of hostile rhetoric suggests confidence in the strategy. As coordination deepens, the practical reality becomes clearer. Washington must engage as one partner among several rather than the unquestioned coordinator. This marks a meaningful evolution in how Western alliances function and how power is exercised in a more distributed global system. Canada and Europe's growing coordination is also visible in regulatory and policy alignment that shapes international commerce and governance. By harmonizing standards across environmental compliance, digital oversight, and industrial regulations, these nations reduce friction in trade and create frameworks that operate independently of US systems. This approach allows businesses to navigate international rules more predictably while diminishing reliance on American approval for compliance. When major economies adopt similar standards, global firms naturally adjust to maintain access to their markets. As a result, the influence of these rules extends beyond Europe and Canada, shaping global practices. Market behavior, rather than political mandates, becomes a key vector of soft power. Regulatory alignment in this way creates a subtle but powerful mechanism of influence, demonstrating that collaboration among Like-minded nations can define global norms without direct US intervention. Diplomatic coordination follows a parallel track. On climate policy, technology governance, supply chain resilience, and institutional reform, Canada and European partners increasingly synchronize messaging. While not framed as opposition to US positions, these coordinated stances establish independent channels of influence. By presenting a united front, allies can reinforce standards and priorities globally while maintaining constructive relations with Washington. Security cooperation, meanwhile, continues to operate within established structures. Yet political alignment increasingly extends beyond these institutions. Canada and Europe coordinate on broader strategic issues, including energy security, intelligence sharing, and cyber policy, in ways that do not require US-tied direction. Influence is becoming more distributed, reflecting a shift from hierarchical leadership to collaborative networks. The implications for US political strategy are significant. For leaders whose messaging emphasizes dominance, loyalty, and unilateral leverage, this evolving environment introduces challenges. When allies act autonomously without confrontation, the traditional measures of influence, pressure, threats, or unilateral policy imposition become less effective. Political authority must now be demonstrated through partnership, cooperation, and negotiation. Trump's earlier policy disputes with European partners, including tariff conflicts, criticism of multilateral institutions, and sudden policy reversals, contributed to this realignment. These tensions exposed vulnerabilities in reliance on US-centered leadership. Canada observed these dynamics and developed its own model emphasizing coordination, mutual benefit, and continuity. Unlike confrontational approaches, this strategy strengthens independence while preserving alliance structures. European leaders view Canada's approach favorably. It provides a bridge between North America and Europe that allows for strategic diversification without provoking political backlash. By framing cooperation as modernization and resilience rather than defiance, European governments reduce potential friction while advancing long-term objectives. Economic considerations further reinforce this realignment. Global disruptions highlighted the risks of centralized supply chains and over-reliance on single markets or political systems. Canada and Europe responded by prioritizing resilience and diversification. Shared investment initiatives, coordinated industrial policies, and joint innovation frameworks reduce vulnerability to unilateral decisions. Canada's geographic and economic position enhances Europe's capacity to act independently while maintaining constructive relations with the United States. Allies are increasingly aware of the benefits of multiple coordination channels. The United States remains indispensable in security, economic, and diplomatic terms, yet its role is evolving from an automatic leader to a participant in a more distributed network of influence. Influence must be negotiated, trust must be built, and cooperation becomes essential rather than optional. This incremental shift represents a quiet yet significant change in the architecture of Western alliances. Traditional assumptions of unilateral dominance are being replaced by a more networked, collaborative approach. Allies are not rejecting the United States, but they are no longer waiting for it. Power is becoming more flexible, distributed, and resilient. The evolving Canada-Europe coordination also extends to diplomatic and multilateral engagement on global issues. By presenting aligned positions on climate change, digital governance, trade standards, and technology oversight, they are establishing influence through collaboration rather than confrontation. These aligned policies send signals to the broader international community that like-minded nations can define rules and norms collectively without relying solely on the United States. This represents a shift from hierarchical leadership to a more networked model of influence. One of the clearest areas of impact is in trade. By harmonizing regulatory standards, Canada and Europe make cross-border commerce smoother and more predictable. Businesses operating internationally can comply with shared environmental, industrial, and digital regulations without constantly referencing American frameworks. This reduces dependence on US-centric models and strengthens the transatlantic partnership as a center of influence in global markets. Over time, The reach of these standards extends as multinational firms adopt them to maintain market access, amplifying their effect on global norms. Diplomatic synchronization has similarly evolved. Canadian and European messaging on issues like climate commitments, energy security, and technology governance now reflects coordinated planning and mutual reinforcement. While these positions do not directly oppose US policy, they function independently. Allies are effectively creating a parallel channel of influence that allows for decision-making, standard setting, and leadership demonstration outside Washington's direct coordination. This makes US's dominance less automatic and compels consultation and negotiation rather than assumption of compliance. Security coordination continues within traditional institutions such as NATO, but political and strategic alignment increasingly reaches beyond those structures. Canada and Europe coordinate on cybersecurity, intelligence sharing, energy resilience, and emerging technologies, creating complementary networks of influence. This approach strengthens collective capacity while preserving alliance stability. Washington remains engaged, but the centralized control that historically defined influence is less absolute. Economically, the shift reflects lessons learned from global disruptions. Supply chain vulnerabilities, energy crises, and geopolitical shocks have emphasized the value of diversification and resilience. Canada and Europe are responding by developing joint industrial policies, investment strategies, and innovation initiatives designed to reduce reliance on any single partner. This approach prioritizes long-term stability over short-term efficiency and strengthens the ability to act independently without antagonizing traditional allies. Politically, this creates a more complex environment for US leaders like Donald Trump. Messaging that relies on dominance and pressure is less effective when allies demonstrate independence without confrontation. Influence increasingly depends on negotiation, trust, and the ability to collaborate. Strategic gains must be earned through partnership rather than imposed through leverage. The Canada-Europe model provides a blueprint for exercising influence quietly through coordination, consistency, and shared benefit. The gradual nature of this shift is deliberate. There is no dramatic rupture, no single defining event, and no public declaration that the United States is being sidelined. Instead, influence is redistributed incrementally, quietly, and effectively. The absence of visible confrontation enhances durability. Canada and Europe strengthen their coordination without provoking political backlash, signaling a new approach to alliance management that emphasizes pragmatism over ideology. Allies around the world are observing closely. Middle powers, in particular, are evaluating whether similar strategies can reduce dependence on dominant powers while maintaining security and economic benefits. The Canada-Europe model may encourage more distributed leadership globally, gradually redefining how influence is exercised across regions. The result is a more resilient, flexible, and networked system of Western alliances. The United States remains essential, but the assumption that leadership is automatic no longer applies. Allies can act independently while preserving relationships, and influence must now be negotiated rather than assumed. As Canada and Europe continue to strengthen their coordination, the practical and strategic implications for the United States become increasingly evident. Washington remains a critical partner in economic, security, and diplomatic terms, but the landscape of influence is shifting. Decision-making is no longer centralized in a single capital. Instead, it is becoming distributed across networks of like-minded nations that share values, goals, and long-term strategic perspectives. This evolution reflects a broader trend toward multi-centered global governance, where influence is negotiated rather than imposed. For political leaders whose messaging relies on dominance and leverage, such as Donald Trump, this shift presents challenges. Traditional tools of influence, including pressure tactics, public ultimatums, and unilateral trade measures, are less effective when allies demonstrate autonomy without confrontation. In this new environment, influence must be exercised through negotiation, partnership, and collaboration. Political authority can no longer be assumed, it must be earned through engagement and cooperation. Economic factors reinforce this evolution. Global disruptions, including supply chain shocks, energy crises, and geopolitical tensions, have highlighted the risks of over-reliance on a single partner or market, and European nations have responded by prioritizing resilience and diversification. Joint investment strategies, coordinated innovation frameworks, and shared industrial policies reduce vulnerability to unilateral actions and increase the capacity for independent decision-making. Canada's involvement adds scale, credibility, and insight into North American markets, enhancing Europe's ability to act confidently while maintaining constructive relations with Washington. Trade alignment continues to play a crucial role. Harmonized standards in areas such as environmental compliance, digital governance, and industrial regulation create predictable conditions for businesses and encourage adoption of shared rules globally. This regulatory influence extends beyond the borders of Canada and Europe, shaping international practices and demonstrating that coordinated leadership can set standards without relying exclusively on US endorsement. Diplomatic coordination also deepens the impact. Shared positions on climate action, technology oversight, and institutional reform demonstrate that like-minded nations can project influence collectively. While these positions do not oppose American policies directly, they operate independently. Allies are effectively creating alternative channels for shaping global norms, reducing the assumption that US leadership is required to achieve consensus or enforce standards. Security cooperation remains anchored in NATO and other established institutions, but political alignment increasingly extends beyond traditional frameworks. Canada and European nations coordinate on cybersecurity, intelligence sharing, and emerging technologies, creating complementary networks of influence. This distributed model strengthens collective capacity while preserving alliance stability. The gradual nature of the shift is intentional. There is no dramatic rupture, no public declaration, and no visible confrontation. Influence is redistributed quietly, incrementally, and durably. Canada and Europe enhance cooperation without provoking backlash, establishing a model of alliance management that emphasizes pragmatism, consistency, and mutual benefit. Other nations are observing closely. Middle powers may emulate Canada's approach to reduce dependency while maintaining security and economic advantages. Over time, this could further dilute the automatic assumption of US dominance and encourage more distributed leadership globally. The result is a Western alliance system that is more flexible, resilient, and networked. The United States remains a vital partner, but the days when leadership was assumed are diminishing. Allies are not rejecting the United States, they are simply acting with greater independence. Power is shared, influence is negotiated, and the architecture of cooperation is evolving. This moment defines a subtle but profound transformation. Allies are no longer waiting for Washington. They are actively shaping the future of transatlantic cooperation, demonstrating that distributed influence, pragmatic coordination, and strategic diversification are now central to the exercise of power in the modern world.